welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I'm going to address a few comments from my recent multitasking benchmark video comparing the Ryzen 5 5600 and Ryzen 7 5700X. Now, if you're not familiar with the replying to comments segment, it's pretty straightforward. The name really says it all. Basically, if there's a good number of comments on a recently released video that I feel could be addressed to further the content, I dedicate some time to doing just that. So let's get into it. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by ASUS's latest range of ROG anime peripherals. The new ROG Strix Flare 2 anime gaming mechanical keyboard features an anime matrix LED display, 8000Hz polling rate, ROG NX mechanical switches or Cherry MX switches, swappable switches, metal media controls, and a wrist rest with light diffuser. And there's also the new ROG Delta S anime lightweight gaming headset with a customizable anime matrix display, Hi-Fi ESS 9281 quad DAC, AI noise cancelling mic, and is compatible with PC, PlayStation 5, and Nintendo Switch. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so towards the end of the multitasking benchmark video, I threw it over to you guys for suggestions on what kind of background tasks you'd like to see included for future testing, and some of you asked for an OBS benchmark. For example, Ricky said, I would like to see OBS streaming as well, and how it impacts performance. And I thought the reply from David was right on the money. David said, but would that not be considered more of a secondary foreground application? At that point, I think 8 cores is warranted. And this is exactly right. It's something that I've tried to make clear in many of my more budget-oriented CPU reviews, essentially by saying parts like the Ryzen 5 5600 are ideal for gaming, but if you're doing something more than just gaming, such as streaming, then a higher-end CPU will be of benefit. Also, OBS it's not really a background task, and it's not a program that the vast majority of gamers use, and those who do use it, well, they use GPU encoding rather than the CPU. That said, I do use my CPU in a secondary streaming PC for encoding with OBS. It's the Core i7 at 12700K, and at 1080p 60 FPS, around 40 to 50% of the CPU is in use. This CPU scores around 23,000 points in Cinebench R23, and that makes it roughly 50% more powerful than the Ryzen 7 5700X. And that means this workload alone would max out the Ryzen 5 5600, and it would basically do the same for the 5700X, leaving virtually nothing left for gaming. You could, of course, reduce the stream quality, which would lower CPU usage, but then you are heavily compromising on the stream quality. I did also cover this in my multitasking benchmark video, and I also pointed out that if you're going to be doing a lot of streaming without a dedicated PC, you're almost always better off using the GPU anyway. Just use that for the heavy lifting. And it does sound like the vast majority of you do that anyway, at which point there would be less of a difference between a 6 and 8 core Zen 3 CPU. That said, at the end of the day, if you have other resource-intensive applications in mind, you'll seriously want to consider your options, and at that point, saving some money on a 6-core processor might not be the best play. There were many similar comments, such as this one here, which also talked about core-heavy productivity workloads, such as rendering. Again, if this is the sort of task you plan on trying to tackle while gaming, the priority here really isn't, well, it's not just gaming, but rather core-heavy productivity workloads, and therefore you should be basing your purchase on which CPU offers you the most value for that particular workload. In my opinion, it's also not really a workload that's going to do a good job of justifying, say, the 5700X over the 5600. The 8-core part will certainly be better, but it's unlikely to enable an enjoyable gaming experience, while a program like V-Ray, for example, is trying to suck up 100% of the CPU's resources. The gaming experience is going to be pretty poor using either CPU. The 5700X will simply complete the rendering task a little bit quicker, at least you'd hope it would, ultimately making it the better solution. But again, we know all this simply by just comparing these two CPUs in a rendering benchmark. Okay, so moving on. Something else that came up quite a lot, actually this probably came up the most, was the discussion around GPU hardware acceleration, and opinions here did vary quite wildly. It's probably true of most subjects, but I think this one there was people on opposing sides. Look, it's true that our testing was done with the default settings for both Chrome and Discord, which does see hardware acceleration enabled, and therefore it does offload much of the heavy lifting to the GPU. Now, in almost all instances, you'll be able to do this, and you'll really want to, both Radeon and GeForce GPUs have dedicated hardware for handling media, which can accelerate these applications with very little impact to performance, and it does heavily reduce CPU load in the process. This hardware is a separate subunit, as in it's separate to stuff like CUDA cores in the case of GeForce GPUs, which provide fully accelerated hardware-based video encoding and decoding for many of the popular codecs. Additionally, it's also possible to use the iGPU and budget parts such as the Core i3-12100 if you don't have the F-SKU. So in our opinion, in almost all instances, you are better off utilizing hardware-based acceleration when you can. And this is really one of the reasons why we've been telling you guys for years now that workloads such as Discord and YouTube have a relatively small impact on modern hardware. Now, a very popular request was for us to test highly recommended and popular current generation budget CPUs such as the Core i3-12100. And I really do like this idea, and it's certainly something we could do next. That said, I wouldn't mind discussing this one ahead of time. Firstly, the 12100 has been recommended by many as a great budget CPU for gamers because it's cheap and offers an impressive level of performance, and all of that's certainly true. It might only be a quad-core with 8 threads, but it rivals older 6-core 12-thread parts and much older 8-core 16-thread parts, so overall CPU performance is good, roughly matching that of the Core i5 10600K and Ryzen 5 at 3600. Therefore, as I see it, gamers buying the 12100 are likely doing so for one of two reasons. Either it's simply all you can afford, and you've recognized that anything brand new that happens to be cheaper is complete trash, or you're conservative with your money, and since you know you'll be just gaming and doing nothing else while you game, then the 12100 will work just fine. The former sees the Core i3-12100 as the best thing money can buy for less than $120 US, while the latter ignores multitasking performance entirely, as the focus is purely on gaming. I guess my point being that people aren't exactly tossing up between a Core i3-12100 and a Ryzen 7 3700X, or anything newer and more expensive. The Ryzen 7 processor started life at $330 US, and it never dipped below, I think, about $270 US, and today still sells for around $150 US secondhand on eBay. So while it is fair to say that the 3700X offers around 40% greater all-core performance, which is a little bit surprising as it is around 5% slower on average, at least according to our gaming benchmarks, if you were to throw some multitasking into the mix there, then I think it would tip things in favor of the 8-core processor, but that's not exactly game-changing information for someone with $120 US or less to spend on a CPU. I mean, if the 12100 had a competitor with significantly more CPU resources, so like an 8-core Zen 3 CPU for roughly the same money, then the multitasking angle would certainly come into play. I suppose you could say the Ryzen 5 5500 with its 6 cores and 12 threads is arguably that competitor, but it does cost a bit more at $140 US. But yeah, I suppose that is an interesting matchup that we could do for our next multitasking benchmark. So if you think that would be a good matchup, the Core i3-12100 and the Ryzen 5 5500 for a multitasking benchmark, then let me know in the comment section below and perhaps I can get started on that. But I think the takeaway here being that not every CPU needs to shine in our multitasking benchmarks. Not all gamers game with loads of active background tasks, and those on a tight budget almost certainly understand the compromises need to be made here. I'm sure they're not shocked that they can't play every game at 4K using ultra quality settings either. And I think being a bit realistic about the performance you're going to get from some of this entry-level affordable hardware kind of goes out the window for some people. I suspect they're probably not budget shoppers. So yeah, it's best to keep in mind that if you're buying something like a Core i3 processor, because it is the cheapest option that really makes sense before you go down to Celeron and Pentium processors that barely play games, that you're not going to be able to do 1,000 things at once, and the gaming experience is not always going to be comparable to a CPU that costs 3 or 4 times more, like a 12700K. Okay, so the next series of comments that I wanted to cover discuss RAM capacity. Lots of you suggested the testing should have been done with 16 gigabytes of RAM rather than 32, or you were just simply interested in knowing what kind of impact RAM capacity would have on the multitasking benchmark results. Firstly, the reason why 32 gigabytes was used instead of 16 was to ensure the testing wasn't limited by RAM capacity or anything to do with memory performance. The goal, of course, was to see just how much of a difference there was between the Ryzen 5 5600 and Ryzen 7 5700X, so ultimately it was more of a real-world CPU benchmark. So hampering performance by limiting the available system memory would likely create a system bottleneck, further eliminating any differences between the two CPUs in question. So this is one of the reasons why I went with 32 gigabytes over 16 gigabytes. Still, depending on the game, I'm sure 16 gigabytes likely would have been just fine, but again, that wasn't an aspect of the testing that I wanted to worry about. Another criticism of the testing, which is sort of in a similar vein, was the use of the flagship Radeon RX 6950 XT, with the suggestion being that this is just too high-end and isn't what most gamers use, which is sort of fair enough, I suppose. But again, the idea was to maximize performance, making it as likely as possible that any performance limitations would be caused by the CPU. And it is worth noting that I did include 1440p data, which simulates the kind of results you'd see with a slower GPU at 1080p. At the end of the day, though, this was a CPU benchmark, not a system benchmark or anything else. As for the second part of that comment, the vast majority of viewers did claim to be playing a 1080p YouTube video while on a Discord call to friends when gaming. As explained in that video, this is why I tested that scenario first. Sort of getting back to the memory capacity discussion, a lot of viewers commented that having just a single Chrome tab open playing the video that we use for testing doesn't really simulate their use case or a realistic real-world use case because they have 20 to 30 tabs and some people even claiming as many as like 300 tabs open while gaming. Others talked about leaving programs such as Photoshop or Premiere open and a whole host of other applications. Thing is though, these programs when left in the background use basically nothing of your CPU while gaming. Very little at most. With Chrome, for example, you could have 7 or 700 tabs open. If they're all on pretty well static websites, then again, very little of your CPU will be used. What's more likely to be used is boatloads of system memory. So that would be more of a RAM benchmark, I suppose, more than a CPU benchmark. But really, if you have 700 tabs open, or I think 200 or 300, I certainly saw people claiming 200 or 300, that will just eat in your system memory. And if you don't have enough system memory, it starts using the page file for tabs that you haven't looked at for a while. And then when you go to those, you'll see that sort of chugging as it's struggling to switch between them. You'll also see that if you alt tab from a game or have it on a separate screen. So yeah, that's more of a memory benchmark. And really, I think memory, in my opinion, people get worked up over whether you need 16 gigabytes or 32 gigabytes. I don't really care too much because if you've bought 16 gigabytes, so 2 8 gigabyte sticks, most motherboards have 4 DIMMs. If later on you find that you need another 2 memory modules, well, you just buy another kit. Their DDR4 memory is relatively inexpensive. You just slot them in and you've doubled your memory. Can't really do that with CPU cores. You sort of have to try and sell your CPU, buy the new one. There'll be quite a lot more money lost there, whereas with the RAM, you're not really losing any money. Anyway, moving on. Actually, I will just say that if you are the kind of user that knows that you're not going to close everything down when you go to gaming, leave boatloads of applications, maybe your Chrome does have quite high CPU utilization because there are a lot of active websites and things open, then yeah, identify that, and maybe you do need to spend about 50% more on something like a 5700X over the 5600. That might be a good idea. It really is up to you to identify how you use your computer and work out what kind of processing power you require to get the job done. And that's really what this entire discussion boils down to. Quite clearly, as I'm learning, no one uses their computer the same way, and no amount of benchmarks is going to solve that. But what you can do is look at the plethora of benchmarks you have available from countless resources across the web and work out how taxing the applications you run are. And of course, you can answer many of these questions yourself by simply looking at the Windows Task Manager and being aware of the overall performance of your current CPU, and then compare that to, well, the available upgrade options. I suppose I'm saying benchmarks will only get you so far. It's up to you to look at the data you've got and apply that to your use case. And with that, I am going to end this replying to comments episode. Like I said, there are a heap more ways we can do this testing. There are a lot more CPU comparisons that can be made, and I'm happy to do them. So I think the Core i3 12100 and Ryzen 5 5500, that could be an interesting comparison. As I found in a recent look at the Ryzen 5 5500, wasn't a huge fan of that CPU. I sort of suggested if you want to spend as little as possible, the Core i3 is a better option. Or if you spend a bit more, the Ryzen 5 5600 is just a much more powerful CPU overall and is worth that small investment. And look, you can make these arguments when going from the 5600 to the 5700X, but I think that's quite a bit more money, and we didn't see anywhere near the performance difference when CPU limited. Anyway, I'll save all that discussion for future content. As I said, let me know what you want to see. If you liked this video, give it a like. I just wanted to follow up on a few points that I saw raised quite a few times on that previous video. Also, subscribe because there will be more content to come. And if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, where you can talk about this stuff to your heart's content on our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams with Tim and myself, that stuff's coming up very shortly, then check it out. There's also behind the scenes content. Tim's getting a new studio, a lot of cool content there. So like I said, check it out if you're interested. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this episode of Replying to Comments. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.